I'm overseeing the winemaking for Boisset collection here in Sonoma at DeLoach, as well as Buena Vista, and other sundry projects that Jean-Charles Boisset has me working on. And when you look at the DeLoach estate, I've had the pleasure of working here. I started here in 2003 and seeing its evolution from what was a very kind of traditional Sonoma County style winery in that day and age, where you're making a lot of different varieties, where, for lack of a better word, things may have been a bit formulaic, and to see him right off the bat infuse it with the energy and the commitment to, transforming it into this Pinot Noir powerhouse, this place where we oversaw one of the first conversions in Sonoma County to biodynamic agriculture across our estate, and going out and exploring, new and upcoming terroirs like down in Marin County, to really see what can happen with Pinot Noir when you look at it through that Burgundian lens, that eye of this piece of terroir. What does it represent? That's just DeLoach. I mean, and that's not talking about what we've done at Buena Vista and beyond. Step back a little bit. In 2003, the Boisset family purchased the winery, actually right around this time, and inherited a site that had been planted by the DeLoaches in the early 1970s, the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, one of the first sites in this part of the Russian River to be planted to those varieties. And over the years, it had been farmed fairly conventionally, and the land was taken care of, but at the same time, the vines were 30 plus years old and were starting to suffer from disease, and really just a lack of health in the soil itself. A lot of the farming practices that were happening in the 70s and 80s and 90s were extractive. You were taking out the nutrients, and you were trying to replace them with salt-based fertilizers, things like that really don't have the ability to keep that soil tilth and health and everything going on. And so we looked at the site in 2004 quite extensively. We saw that there was tremendous quality capabilities here. In fact, that 2004 vintage of our estate Pinot Noir was the Wine Enthusiast #1 wine of the year, but the yields were horrendous. The number of dead vines out in the field was tragic. And so we went to the process of revitalizing the land. And that involved tearing out those vines. It involved, keeping a full year of cover crop rotations going on. So all of 2005 was all about just bringing health back into the vineyard, bringing a lot of compost in. We did successive cover crops, first with nitrogen, green growers, vetches, clovers, things like that. And then coming back in right before that final rip, before we planted the vines, putting safflower in, getting something that really allows the soil to be quite friable, so you can go in, rip it, amend it with all that compost that we have generated through all our great local dairy cows, and brought it back to a level of health and tilth, so that in 2006 we started that planting. Farming's not easy. And I remember the struggles in those early days with those first plants that we put in, farming them biodynamically and getting used to this growth pattern. I went to UC Davis. You watch vines growing, and you expect things to be up the wire, within a year or two. And here it's a little bit slower when you're farming biodynamically. It takes 3-4 years. And we were struck in 2008 by pretty significant frosts. I remember it came in sequential weekends, and we saw at first the new growth coming out of our plants getting burnt back, knowing that we had those secondary buds that were still, back in reserve for us, so that we would still have living plants coming out. And then 2 weeks later, it was, I believe it was actually April 16th. It was right around tax day. Another frost came through, and it killed off all our secondary buds. And we lost almost a third of the plants here down to the graft union. And so that set us back. And where we had been hoping to have that initial estate harvest coming off in 2009, we actually did finish our conversion to Demeter certified biodynamic agriculture in 2009. We actually had to wait one more year to see that very initial harvest coming off of the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
That had to be hard, but not only that, but heartbreaking losing a crop like that.
We were walking the field and just, you're looking at it wondering, it's not just losing grapes, it's losing plants. Like years of energy and work, and knowing that it will be better, but that day was just hard, and it was just hard everywhere. But it was better. We got better. We grew. We planted some amazing rootstocks and scions on this property, and I have had the pleasure now of, this has been my 13th harvest. We've now wrapped up 2022 of that estate vineyard. And I feel like we are making better wines each and every year because of that commitment that we made to the land here. It's so often in the wine industry, you kind of burn through the wines that you're always talking about the latest vintage that you're selling, or the ones that you've just put down into the cellar. And here at the winery, we've had the opportunity with our estate wines to collect them in our cellars and actually offer them to our guests. And over the past several months, we've been bringing out a past vintage. In fact, we just had the 2012 that we were tasting in the tasting room a few weeks ago, and seeing what this wine, 10-year-old Pinot Noir from the Russian River Valley, nice. Absolutely singing. And really it was rewarding to me to me, it wasn't a very good vintage. That's where it was even more rewarding, right? Because you're looking at a wine that you remember as a fairly big crop, had very nice fruit, but maybe didn't have the body and structure you think are going to be age-worthy. And then to come back to it 10 years on and see this wine that not only puts a smile on my face, but is putting smiles on people who are just tasting it for the very first time. That's incredibly rewarding. And it shows that, winemakers are often wrong, but it is the glass that proves itself. Early on, it was a big challenge. I'll be honest. I was fresh out of UC Davis. I come from a fairly traditional farming family in Sonoma, Marin County, and biodynamics seemed like voodoo and things like of that nature that, you hear people talk about and think, well, they just have this romantic thought process, a romantic, theory of agriculture. It's not real. And so I approached it as a skeptic. And it started at UC Davis. I mean, some of our classes, we talked about biodynamics. We talked about, the practical approaches it had, but also the limitations. And unfortunately, sometimes we get caught up in, finding a single thread that we disagree with, and we lose sight of the whole picture. And ironically, that's what biodynamics, to me now, really is all about, is trying to encapsulate that whole picture of agriculture. And so when we start talking about the mysticism of the stars and the lunar cycles and, the dancing naked around the horn in the middle of the moon, it's stories that, maybe someone did, but it really isn't fundamental what biodynamics is. And so when I started working here with Greg LaFollette, who was our first consulting winemaker back in 2004, he brought a much more natural approach to his winemaking, and also helped me bridge my understanding of what biodynamics was doing to our site and in our wines. And really it is, I believe, and what I believe Steiner was discovering before we really knew, was the microbiological kind of backbone that goes into our soils and into our winemaking, something that they were just scratching the surface on back in the 1920s and 30s. Mm-hmm. And now we know fundamentally throughout our lives we're very much controlled by what the microbiosphere is. And so when we look at soil health and when you look at the health of our soil here at DeLoach, fundamentally, it was dead land. There was no earthworms in this soil. It was full of nematodes killing our plants. And that's what happens when you're using all sorts of synthetics over and over again, and you have a soil that's compacted, and you're not adding back the complex macronutrients you need to keep a soil food web alive. And so how we brought that health back, how we brought that soil back through compost, through, cultivation of green manures that are going back into the soil. Really, it gave us a living soil. And you see it in the tilth that's here versus what used to be here. But you also see it in the winemaking process, where previously a lot of the wines were being made, in a very proscriptive fashion. You're adding 2 pounds per thousand of yeast. You're adding DAP. You're adjusting with, tartaric acid. You're dialing everything into, this is how this wine needs to be made, as opposed to, well, this is what this vineyard is, and we're going to kind of peel it back, and we're going to let the native yeast here, and we're going to let the native nutrients coming off these grapes drive this fermentation. And where does that lead us to? Well, it leads us to a whole spectrum of flavors and styles of wine that you can craft with in an interesting way, a very minimalist approach, because all you're doing is watching and guiding. You have to pay attention. It's not lazy winemaking. Sometimes we joke about it being lazy winemaking, but it's very much making sure that you're following the details, letting that healthy fermentation take off because you've provided it the healthy environment. It's the same idea with our soils and our plants. As long as we can keep that environment healthy, then that whole biodynamic approach moves forward. www.deloachvineyards.com. We also have some tremendous social media outreach that goes on, Facebook, Instagram, whether it's following Jean-Charles Boisset or DeLoach or any of the sister properties of Boisset, you'll see us out there. And I have to recommend, though, please, when you get a chance, come and visit us here at the property. It is one of the most gorgeous sites, I think, in the wine country, especially when you get a chance to tour the gardens and come back and see our overlook over the Laguna. There's nothing better than a sunset over the Laguna in the back of DeLoach with a glass of Pinot Noir.